All right, world building mistakes you don't know you're making. Let's dive in.
As fun as world building can be in the moment, you are literally playing God when you do. And
Yeah.
seeing as you actually aren't, unless I'm missing something, there are a lot of pitfalls that you can fall into. And it starts with the mindset that a lot of world builders don't put themselves into. I need you to pay complete attention and at least try to internalize the words that are about to come out of my mouth.
Okay.
Every aspect of our reality, as you see it, is subject to change in a fantasy world that you created. Sounds obvious, right? But it's not just things like climate down to fashion, religion, common sayings, days of the week. We can take things many steps further. Days don't have to be a concept in your world. Gender roles could be non-existent. Crustaceans.
Yeah, he's right. I mean, we often try to, and even I do this, so I'm going to say like we, and I also include myself in this, but we often try to mirror our own world into the fantasy one. And I think to some extent that's a good thing, right? Because it provides familiarity. Even Elder Scrolls has its own days of the week, but they mimic our own. And so we can transfer our own understanding of what a day looks like into this fantasy world. But he's right, it could go even deeper to the point where you are completely rewriting our own understanding of reality and creating a new one here. And I don't see many fantasy authors do this, and I think it's because they want to create, as you say, Lazaro, the relatability, the ability to understand immediately how certain basal aspects of this world work. And we have that in our world building, for instance, is that in Colden Chronicles, we want the player to, we have seasons, right? We have weather, we have things that the player can go into our game and understand are just like our real world. That way, the things that we can present them that are more fictitious and magical and fantastical are things that they're ready to dive into from a fresh perspective. But he's right. When you're creating the world from scratch, you don't have to go into this. He's right. Like gender roles, maybe it's the other way around. Maybe there are gender roles in our society because we are coming from from apes, from monkey. We had very realistic survival reasons why men are doing one thing primarily and women were doing one thing primarily. It's because we were just genetically evolved to be good at separate things, and so we naturally just want to help each other. So men do the physical stuff, hunt, whatever, and women take care of the children because their bodies are literally made for doing this. And it worked, and I think it still works, arguably, if you want to have a hot take for the day. But maybe in this fantastical world, different fantasy races, different species evolved to survive different things. So their gender roles might be completely reversed or just very different and have very different focuses.
Could be the dominant species. The world could actually be flat. It's a great series.
True.
Check it out. There is no standard for fantasy or sci-fi. Not Tolkien, not D&D, not The Expanse, or whatever else you're thinking of in your mind right now. Allow me to introduce the magical cube of problems. We just tackled one side, and this next side is where you curb what I just said. Hard. Yes, we have a sandbox where we can literally do anything, but that definitely does not mean you have to do everything.
It's true.
There are usually two reactions to the every aspect of our reality is subject to change bit. One is that scene from Inside Out where all the little sprites in your brain are running around and everything's on fire, and the other is, oh, I can build everything, and then trying to build every single aspect of your world. The latter is what we in the biz like to call world builder's disease, and it is as common as it is deadly. Trust me.
Yeah, I've worked with writers like that where I think, another way to word what he's saying is where you think that just because you can change everything that you should change everything. And, we mentioned that before he even got to this, right? Where there is a good balance between, as Lazarla said, relatability and fantasy. Where if you just throw somebody into a fantasy world where you have literally changed every single thing, now people don't have anything to latch onto. Their brains are like babies. They have to relearn everything from scratch, and a lot of people just don't want to do that when they sit down and play a game. Elder Scrolls, you're like, okay, you have different days, names for the days of the week, but they still have a week. They still have days. And so you can understand that there's still this continuation, and there are a certain number of weeks in a year within their universe. So it's a different flavor, but it's the exact same ingredient, right? Behind is a flat world in the ocean falling down the edges. Is it really? What are you watching? We're watching world building mistakes you don't know you're making. But I know I'm making them. I do. I had this problem when I was younger. Yeah, I think we all did, right? But the imagination is great. Like, the imagination is a beautiful thing, and if you curb it too much, you also run into a case of where you're too afraid to jump into world building because you don't want to make mistakes. But I also, I think that's partly with me where I want to do world building, but I know how much time it takes, and it's really hard for me to be creative on stream. It's really hard for me to do certain design things, like just to think about how a world works on stream, because my mind is just not working 100% for thinking. Finding their mistakes limits creativity and makes for cookie cutter shit. Yeah. That's true. I mean, I guess mistakes in this case would be, if I had to define them, contradictions, in your own world. I know people shit on like Harry Potter for that a lot, but you can even see that certain contradictions people just don't care about. Like, sometimes it matters and sometimes it doesn't. So it depends on how like seriously you treat your world. A contradiction or a mistake in like Song of Ice and Fire is way, way worse, because George Martin goes to exceptional lengths to keep a lot of the rules of his universe continuing and going forward without contradiction. But then you have like Harry Potter, and it's like, well, it's a different audience, and some of the things that are contradicted don't really fuck other things up too much. Whether or not Polyjuice Potion transfers the person's voice onto the individual or not. It's like, you could say, well, maybe Hermione just didn't make it properly the first time, but it's supposed to do it, so it's like, whatever. It fits the narrative. Who cares? Just pointing out things that beginner world builders tend to do that keep them from conducive. Yeah, I agree. We're getting too deep. We're actually going deeper into this world building video than he's actually going to it. So let's continue watching him.
I see this a lot in world builders. I actually struggle with it a bit myself, where they'll completely ignore the fact that there's an entire story that works in tandem with their world. Whether you're crafting a D&D campaign or writing the next Star Wars. Hey, if you're world building to world build, knock yourself out. But if your story is heavy on the political intrigue, then an emphasis on borders and rulers is a natural step towards that. Might want to focus more on magic if your protagonist has to learn it at some point. Your Silmarillion doesn't need to be nearly as extensive if you don't plan to publicize it like Tolkien did. And as is the nature of a problem cube, once you solve one side, another side rears its ugly head.
You can also do a lot of world building that is subtle. Like, you can just mention something. Take an empty space in your world, throw a sentence of an idea into it. Like, this chasm was created when this war happened. Just say that. And you've done the bare bones. And, we can do that with Colton Chronicles because the game takes place in one location. The player isn't traveling around to different locations. So we can hint at certain things and then build upon those blocks later when they're relevant in other games or in, some of these NPC stories. You don't have to think of everything. You can just put some blocks down, find a way to go from A to B at a later point.
I've already noticed the issue. So right now, this is your story, and this is the world you've built around it. All this blank space are things you could have built but didn't. And that is simultaneously the best case scenario and the worst thing that you can do. You didn't waste time on things that won't show up, but then there is this flimsy line between what's built and what isn't. If the reader stands here and looks at your world at large, which they will because they're smart, it starts to fall apart very quickly. This is where Ernest Hemingway comes in. His icebook theory loosely states,
now you listen Yo, you little you, as the writer, are supposed to know all of this. You're gonna get in your shitty little writer submarine and you're gonna see the entire iceberg. Now, your readers, they're dumb as and they only see the top of the iceberg because their little brains can only stay on the surface. But because your brain is shockingly not as smooth, you know the entire iceberg and you can frame it in such a way that their thick little heads think they can see the entire thing. It's hilarious.
Thanks, Ernie.
You.
What a lovely man. He's also right, by the way. But the thing is, we already established that it's not ideal to build every detail in your world. We can't know the entire iceberg. So what's the answer?
True.
Fake it. We remove the start line and get a gradient instead. The amount of world building fades with the vision of the reader. The mountain gets...
I think that's another way of putting it, like I was explaining it. Just place blocks around that make it the reader think that you have written some grandiose lore about this area. You know, just take your imagination, let it place a couple blocks there, and you can always expand upon it later, but, you know, yeah, fake the iceberg in this case. Is very right. The thing with stories and games, I like to play games and I like to read books. I don't like when they interrupt each other. So you don't like reading lore in games, which I completely can understand. I think for me, what players seem to enjoy the most, because I did a survey many, many years ago where it seems that most players prefer like audio logs that don't interrupt the gameplay too much because it's something that they can listen to, right? Just put you on to have something on while making dinner. Hey, Gem in Twitch. How you doing?
foggier the further...
Enjoy listening. Also don't like gameplay to interrupt the story. I agree. Gotta hook me on the lore for me to read your books. 100% agree too. Yep, I agree. I don't really like when games just start and I have to read a whole bunch of shit. I don't mind. If I get really immersed, I'll read the things that are given to me, right? And especially if the game teaches me that by reading those things, I can utilize them to my advantage, right? What I really hate is games that don't do that, especially like RPG games. For instance, Baldur's Gate 3. There's no point of reading anything because none of it actually matters. And it's not very entertaining. At least in Elder Scrolls, you have some pretty entertaining books like Lusty Argonian Maid, right? So even if you're just trying to enjoy some extra lore, there's usually an entertaining flavor to it. What I don't like is when it's just, oh, here's some lore that adds to the universe, but literally doesn't do anything for you. Like audiobooks that give hints to environmental puzzles that tend to make me engage with them. 100% agree on that. Yeah. Yep, I like when there's actual reason to read. It doesn't mean that everything in a game that can be read should have some benefit, but that maybe by reading it, it can give me a little bit of understanding of a character, and I can make a better choice when it comes to supporting them or not supporting them, right? Firestar is the book equivalent of a game that makes you figure out everything, even the controls. Didn't read past the first one, even though the lore was super interesting. For me, it's like some games just do it, some games don't. Hey, Freedom DAO. Doesn't need to be every audio log. If it's in one, I'll listen to them all in case. Yeah, I like audio logs, especially if they're properly paced throughout the gameplay so that it's not like you have an audio log next to an NPC that you're about to have a cutscene with, because so I'm just supposed to stand here and wait until the audio log's finished? Why can't you put this in an area where you have specifically designed nothing to occur for the next 30 minutes while this audio log takes place, so that I can just like explore, loot some things, look at the scenery while listening to the audio log? It's hard to do, but I think more people will listen to it if that's the case. Did manage to find some advantage here and there by reading books in Baldur's Gate 3. Just stopped playing because there was so much. For me, I don't know, I'm not going to dive into my thoughts on Baldur's Gate 3. We've already gone through that.
We go. They'll get to a point where they can't even see the mountain anymore, but they'll know it's still there.
7 out of 10 at best.
All there is blank space. All the work you didn't suffer doing.
Diagrams
Yes.
and metaphors are fantastic, but how do you actually apply this?
Well, let's go back to our story that's heavy on the political intrigue, or in other words, Game of Thrones. The borders, maps, and
It should be heavy on the political intrigue, and then it just kind of stops in like the last few seasons. So an audio log, you mean like a conversation in car drives? I mean, that kind of works too. Like a conversation works. Um, but maybe it is like an audio log, like Last of Us has audio logs, right? And I think Last of Us did a pretty good job of breaking that up, so you were just exploring a place. There were no enemies for that moment, and you could listen to the audio log, and you had character reactions. So the audio log was like a dynamic 3D, it was a dynamic gameplay feature where you listen to it, and then Ellie would say something, and then Joel would respond to that, right? So you would have a benefit of listening to it because the characters would actually think that it was being listened to. It's like they were learning at the same time that you were learning. I think there are some really nice ways to handle it. I know with you could almost say Mimir in God of War was like an audio log NPC. He was just spitting out facts and information and lore about the world. But it only ever happened in times where they were in the boat, and I'm talking about like the God of War 2018, right? When they were in the boat, when they were exploring some ruins or whatever, and you would have this world building being given to you in a way that didn't make you have to stop and watch like a cutscene or stand and read a book for 10 minutes while your characters did nothing. You could just immerse yourself in the game, have some beautiful narration and world building by an actual NPC that has a point of being in the game. So there are clever ways to do it, and I think there are some lazy ways to do it. I think that books in a lot of cases are the least amount of work for the least amount of benefit, unless that book is entertaining to an extent. There's a benefit to reading it beyond just understanding more about the world.
The people in power need to be clearly defined because those are the main pieces that are interacting in the story.
Yes.
We need to understand pretty much everything about them for the interactions to make sense. Alright, what's the next natural progression? So how do those powerful people get in power? History. Another part of our world we need to flesh out details.
It's like, wars, marriages, deals, connivery. This is what I really like about George Martin is he puts so much effort into this, into the names, into the laws, into creating historical events that have lasting impact and memory within the world, right? Like the Reigns of Castamere, and the historical significance to that, and why that song is both an asshole thing for the Lannisters to play in some cases, but is also very feared by the entire world because of what happened. So, it's, if you want to go this route of this political intrigue, he's right, you have to put the work into it. Can I make a share about the art of world generation? What do you mean?
Going to dictate how those political parties
Make a video?
interact.
Go for it.
Oh, culture is going to be a big part of that as well. Ironborn and people of the North are not going to interact the same.
Yes.
Culture's on the list. And the ball
Culture's a big
rolling
thing.
and rolling, but notice how we don't talk about religion or the lower class. Even though those elements do come into play later, they're not nearly as significant. You hear the old gods, the Lord of Light, the Drowned God, you see the religious call in King's Landing. And judging from how extensively the rest of Westeros has been built, you assume
I would say that the religion and lower class aspects of Game of Thrones, the TV show, don't matter much because the writers took it out. If you've read the books of Song of Ice and Fire, the religious aspect is way, way, way more important, and amazing, fantastical, magical events like Dany surviving the fire, that gives birth to her dragons, spoiler alert, is something that you've seen history in the making. Like, this is an event that will not be repeated for forever. It's a one in a millennium event, and this has significance, and this is due to her lineage, and is also a bit of a sacrifice that's been made in this case. So, there are religious aspects, and I guess more like witchery aspects, I guess you could say in that case. Thank you for the spoiler alert. It's Game of Thrones. Everybody knows dragons, right? It's called House of the Dragon. Everybody knows the Targaryens have dragons. But either way, the writers didn't really make a big deal out of this. In the long run, they cut a lot of the the fire priest stuff. You know, they cut out the Grey Lady, so when Catelyn Stark is killed, she gets resurrected as this vengeful being, this like vengeful zombie being that is just ruthless, vengeful, you know, shit that she does to the people who have any connection to the Red Wedding. So there's a lot more like religion, and especially with like lower class stuff that they talk about in the books. So I think it's mainly that it just doesn't appear in the show because the writers, you know, you don't have enough time to talk about stuff like that, or you cut things that don't have major significance to the plot. And of course, we all know how the last few seasons went, so
there's just as much depth to the religion as well. You see the mountain inside the fog, and there is more depth, but Martin doesn't have to build the religions of all 30-something deities in his world. He probably did for fun though. His lore book is actually what House of the Dragons is based off of. Also, Martin has an incredibly huge world, so most things are probably going to be built. But something like the Gentleman Bastards is an excellent example of the other end of the spectrum. If you're a superfan though, you probably know all those 30-something deities, but you don't need that to understand the story of Game of Thrones. And would you look at that? We're halfway there. More than halfway there.
What?
You see, this side of the cube was forgetting to make everything cohesive. All these aspects of your world are not independent of each other. They need to interact to create a believable world. It's so funny when I see stories like, oh...
And if you ask me, this is the exact reason why Winds of Winter is not released yet. Because I can't imagine, if anybody knows, Winds of Winter is the next book in the Song of Ice and Fire series that people have been literally waiting for, I think, over a decade now in order to be released. And it's supposed to be the final culmination of a lot of plot lines. I'm not going to say which ones, because it would be spoilers. But so many of the plot lines are coming together in Winds of Winter that I can't imagine as a writer trying to properly close all of these loops. I mean, there are so many open in the books. There's so many loops open. I mean, you have characters that are still alive in the books that were killed off in the show way long ago. And how do we bring these all together and make, you know, good endings, good satisfying endings to these characters? I can't imagine that. I don't blame, you know, George Martin for maybe kind of just biting off more than he could chew. I don't see how any writer could bring a world together in the way that he has. So I kind of feel like that's maybe where he's at, is where not only did the TV show really fuck up his story in a lot of ways, and it spoiled the most likely ending, which is, it's probably the exact same ending that's going to be in the books, right? Is, you know, what happened in the last season of the TV show, but it's going to happen in a very different way, and there's going to be a lot more build up to those actions. So he probably feels really shit because people have been spoiled about the ending of his book, but that it was handled in a terrible way, so now people associate Game of Thrones with something that's bad, or that ended poorly. And then he has to tie up all of these events that happened in his books differently. I don't know. It's wild. I feel really bad for him. A lot of attempts at visual world generator have been attempted by video games. I made a text generator for simulated environment universes. We can tune data in and out. Imagine a data box with a one-on-one version of reality, or any reality you can think of as the idea. Generate a connection to a multiverse. What the hell? So you're like generating an entire universe with your program? Jesus. IRL map, IRL restaurants, all the data, it's in the sim box. You can even paint the reality using some other weird multiverse models. That sounds crazy. I don't know if I'd ever use something like that, but that sounds crazy.
Interact to create a believable world. It's so funny when I see stories like, oh, this is medieval England, but everyone has magic. If everyone had magic, it would not look like medieval England. People would use it in their everyday lives, for transport, for work. There would probably be a caste system around it. It would dictate culture. You can't just dump something into your world and say it doesn't affect anything else. Think about it like orbiting planets. The bigger the change is from real life, the more gravity it will have on everything else. We've already mentioned magic, so let's go there. It's another significant aspect of Game of Thrones world building. How does it relate to the political intrigue? Well, dragons are a part of the magic, and
Yes.
they are essentially nukes. If you have one, you are all powerful, which is why the Targaryens were able to stay in power for so long. Do you see how it also gravitates towards history? This power makes the Targaryens akin to gods among
But the
common-
dragons are also the reason that the Targaryens lost power in a lot of cases, because they started chaining them up. The dragons became smaller and more docile, and because of that, it's not only a good reason for why they lost a lot of their power within the universe, but it's also a symbolism of that loss of power, that the dragons became chained and became docile and weak, and Dany literally had to unchain her dragons. She had to free her dragons, free herself from those bonds in order to become the Targaryen, right? The tyrant. There's so much great symbolism and depth to George Martin's writing that I think was lost in the show in a lot of cases, but I think that one was one that stayed very well. Is that a remake GTA but IRL simulator, and each state is like 300, 400 terabytes? I don't know though, because I'd have to see something like that in action to see if a generator of a universe is as interesting as a universe made by a human. I don't know. And there might be a psychological element to that, right? Where people, at least right now, may not willingly buy into a generated universe the same way they would buy into a universe made by a person. If you have a demo of the bot, I'd love to see it. It'd be interesting to talk about. Difference between making a pie from scratch and having to reinvent the universe to make a pie from scratch. You have to have some concessions on complexity and causality. Yeah, I agree with that. Designed for Twitch. The first simulator, of course, I put on here. Oh. How does it work, like, with Twitch, though? I mean, I assume that it's probably in your GitHub README, right? Multiverse generator. Collaborative Twitch-based choose your own adventure. I mean, this uses OpenAI stuff, right? So I assume that there is a token limit, because you're running it off of, I assume, ChatGPT LLM. Or am I wrong about that? Heard about a statistic that says players get bored in open world games if there's no new location within 40 seconds of travel. Can you, if you ever find that statistic, Frades, let me know about that. I'd be curious to read whatever study that was done on or something, just for, like, you know, educational purposes. I was looking at Twitch token generator. Twitch integration for GPTs. Only like penny or two. OpenAI agree, make it cheap. But you'd still have a token limit too, and I don't know how big the token limit is for ChatGPT. I know that with self-hosted, like Llama, for instance, or Mixtral, I was able to get like 512,000 self-hosted tokens or something, which is pretty damn nice. Or O was 128k. It's pretty good.
folk, thus dictating an aspect of culture. This can play very well with the next part of the cube once you solve it, which is ignoring the rule of cool or focusing too much on realism. I imagine most world builders don't have a problem with this one, but they ignore one crucial aspect of it. This is a bit similar to the first side of the cube, but whereas that one was more focused on showing you how far you can take world building, This one is different because you probably already have one or two really cool ideas you want to execute. This is speculative fiction. Execute your crazy, insane ideas. Your readers and audience want
I have a problem
to
with
be
this.
transported to another world. Here's the secret. That's probably why they like the genre so much. They will
He's not
suspend
wrong.
your disbelief and give you leeway to do it. Now, why I said this can pair really well with cohesiveness is that, yeah, do the cool thing you want to do, but don't ignore how it interacts with the rest of the world you.
That's the problem I have, is when writing things in my universe, I try to find a way to explain it in universe, even if I don't ever tell the players that. Because I like reading stories and engaging in universes that if I delve into, okay, how did this event occur though? And if there is that lore available, or if there is that explanation available, it makes me love that universe more, because I know that the writer didn't just pull it out of their ass and, oh, we just wanted to do it, so we did it, and we don't really have an explanation for why it happened. If I can see that there was conscious thought and reason to go from point A to B for like a character, I love that, because it's like, okay, I didn't catch that in game, or it wasn't explained in game, but once I sat down and started to think about it, and you showed me this tertiary lore for it, I was like, wow, yeah, it makes sense. I mean, because that rule exists and the magic can't do this, so they ended up doing this because of that. I love that. That's why the story of the game I'm making needs to fit around what I already have. I want everything to feel cohesive. Yeah, cohesive is a great word to put it.
Built. For example, in the fantasy world that I'm currently working on for my novel, I just wanted to make the most coolest outlandish creatures that I could come up with. But then I hadn't surrounded this concept with a world where these creatures would naturally evolve to be these things, which could create a disconnect in the reader's mind. So I was like, how do I solve this? Why don't I just make natural evolution not a factor? Unnatural evolution. Magic leaks in from another dimension and warps the world in whatever way it sees fit. Nobody's arguing the science of evolution with me if I give them that as my reason.
But now there's this problem of magic leaking in from elsewhere.
Wait, that's not a problem. Hell yeah, what else does magic change? The landscape? The people? What if I'm writing sci-fi and I can't just magic things into my world? An alien race brings in a crazy virus that only morphs animals. I still get my cool outlandish creatures. When you constrain yourself to not just what you want, but how it will affect other things, you start to come up with really interesting ways for them to interact. You create.
Yeah, he's very right. You know, that's again, that's one of the things I love about like George Martin. I think Freerun has a really, really well explained magical system within its universe. Like, it has a history. I think Mushoku Tensei does a great job too of providing you with a easy to understand, but also, I'll say, like, rigid magic system. And I really enjoyed that in like Mushoku Tensei, because I could understand exactly what magic can and can't do. And it makes me get more involved, because I know that they're not just going to pull like a shonen action here, like it's like Naruto or Dragon Ball, and you know, they're just going to like do something random because now we need this character to be stronger. I like when there are limits, when there are rules to this, and a character can't do something that is just out of nowhere. Or digging is getting miles too. The whole I'm digging? Who's digging?
Chemical reactions that take you places you never expected to go, and your world is usually better for it. Now, you might have already noticed that you can't just solve 5 sides of a problem cube. You've already used the pieces on the other side.
I can't solve a Rubik's Cube at all.
The pieces that are left solve the last side. And that is what happens when you fix all of these problems. It becomes nearly impossible for you to create a stagnant world, which is another thing I see in countless of worlds.
Stagnant
the
world?
90s were not the same as the 2000s, and both of them were completely removed from the 60s.
Wait, how many banger TV shows did he just put up?
Which is another thing I see in countless of worlds. The 90s were not the same as the 2000s.
There's some pretty banger shows up here right now. Courage the Cowardly Dog, you have Powerpuff Girls, you had Codename Kids Next Door, Ed, Edd n Eddy. I know for sure these were the 4 that I jumped onto the most. Especially Ed, Edd n Eddy, Powerpuff Girls, and Courage the Cowardly Dog. Loved it.
And both of them were completely removed from the 60s. Things will look different a decade from now, and that's all within one Lifespan. The world is constantly evolving. Yeah, dragons are nukes and the Targaryens have been in power for centuries, but then the Baratheons took over, then the Lannisters. It doesn't always have to be wars and coup d'etats. Technology can change your world, cultural evolution, the environment. And it's okay if your story doesn't focus on this, but having it happen in the background can make your world feel so much more
Yeah,
realistic.
well, just it makes it, especially if you're playing a game, right, where, you know, usually world building is meant so that people can they can exist within the world, right? Either you're making like a tabletop game, a game, you're writing a story, and having, and of course, when you're writing like a book, you're going to have the person reading it kind of stamp themselves into the life or into the observing party of the main character or the characters that are taking place. Having things happen in the background shows that the writer knows that this is a world, that the world continues turning in the background even when the player is not directly there, right? And I think that's something we will explore pretty deeply in Golden Chronicles, because everything that happens in this world, the player is very unlikely to be anywhere around it. You're isolated in a forest as an alchemist. You're not in these cities, you're not taking part in these wars, but you are affecting these wars in small ways, or seemingly small ways that have a large impact. So that, as a whole concept of things happening that the player doesn't have any control over, or doesn't have any direct control over, is exactly what Golden Chronicles will explore.
But there is one final part of the cube, and that is the cube as a whole. I am milking this metaphor for everything it's got, huh? What this is right here is trust. And I have to be real, if you're watching this, chances are you don't have it. Sanderson can create a world where the readers have to climb a 100-meter brick wall and their fingernails to understand the world, and they will. At least I know I will, because I also know there's going to be an amazing story on the other side of that wall. Yeah, everything I talked about is going to help you create a better world, and Sanderson does all that too, but he can ignore things like not world building as deep or creating touchstones to our reality. He has a lot of leeway because of who he is. He can scramble the cube a little bit and still present it to his readers as a complete world and story, and they'll accept it. Same goes for King and Martin and any other famous author. They have already established that trust, their rapport with their readers for years and years. So just keep in mind that emulating everything they do might not always be the best thing for you. That being said, there is something they do that everyone should, and you can find that out in this video right here. Side note, I know this isn't actually how you solve a cube. Pro cubers, do not come at me. Okay, bye.
No, that was nice. I really enjoyed that. Touchy subject. Did we ever watch Touchy Subjects? Either way, yeah, really enjoyed that. That was a nice video. Titled World Building Mistakes You Don't Know You're Making. So that was a really fun thing to think about, and we will probably be making a lot of these mistakes ourselves when we're writing our own stories. So should be pretty interesting. But thank you for watching that one.